So as I told you last time, St. Alphonsus really becomes interested in moral theology as a result of his doing mission, of his coming into contact regularly on a wide scale. He himself, along with the other members of his Redemptorist community, which will eventually grow and become a religious order, taking the religious vows several years in the future. But they are coming into contact regularly with situations they are hearing in the confessional from these poor, simple country people that the textbook presentations of moral theology are not helping them know how to respond to or how to help the people resolve their life situations. The textbooks on moral theology at that time were quite black and white, the ones that were being taught in the seminary. And the textbook that Alphonsus himself had studied about moral theology in the seminary was written by a very famous rigorist who was very, very black and white. If they do this action, it's a sin, this must be the penance, and you're done, okay? But Alphonsus and his fellow Redemptorists are discovering telling people that something is right and wrong is helpful to an extent, but it doesn't really help them change their life situation. It doesn't help them avoid falling into the same sin again. A lot of them can't even understand or see for themselves the rightness or the wrongness of what you're telling them, which is a prerequisite for it to be a moral act, according to the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas, and Alphonsus knew this. So you're telling them that the church says that it's right and wrong, and so they know in their conscience that the church says it's wrong, but they don't know themselves in their conscience or see why it's wrong. And Alphonsus knew that in order to avoid evil, you have to see the evil yourself. But even if you see the evil yourself, that doesn't necessarily give you the strength of will to avoid doing it. Or even when you see the good that you're called to do, it doesn't give you the strength or the power interiorly to actually make the choice to do it. For that, you need divine grace. This, of course, also St. Thomas Aquinas taught this. It's very, very strict teaching of the Catholic Church we find in the Catechism to this very day. But at that time, that idea was being radically challenged as a result of the decadence of the scholastic method of doing theology, combined with an uncritical acceptance of some of the new ideas of the Enlightenment that were creeping into theology in an uncritical and unreflected way. Alphonsus will reflect and try to correct some of these wrong movements during the course of his life, and he'll pay a very heavy price for that. But anyway, in response to the questions being raised to him by his fellow Redemptorists that they've encountered in the confessional and his own life experience, he starts studying moral theology again. And he doesn't just study moral theology, he's also developing a parallel theology of prayer, because he again understands knowledge of good and evil is one thing. Having the ability to do good and evil is a different thing. And in order to be able to do what your conscience shows you is good and avoid what your conscience shows you as evil or what the law tells you is evil, you have to receive divine grace. And the only place you receive divine grace is through prayer and the sacraments. So he's the awareness. We've got to instruct people in the confessional. We've got to give them healthy, true, correct, authentic answers and guidance about what to do, about whether or not they have sinned, the kind of sin they've been involved in, help them see it for themselves, and give them guidance about how to improve their life. But we've also got to teach them to pray, because without the prayer, they'll never have the ability to do what their mind shows them through our guidance that they need to do. So prayer and moral theology go hand in hand for Alphonsus, a lesson which unfortunately kind of got lost over the centuries, that we Redemptorists are trying to constantly bring the two together. The quality of our spiritual life is revealed by the quality of our moral life as kind of a litmus test of the authenticity of our spiritual life. And without a spiritual life, a moral life is practically impossible for a Christian. That's what we believe. Okay? One must pray in order to live a moral life, because God gives us the ability through the prayer. Okay. So Alphonsus is bringing all of this stuff together. He begins by commenting on the greatest and most well-read moral theological manuals of the time, and he chooses one in particular, the Moral Theological Manual of the Jesuit theologian named Busenbaum. And Busenbaum is quite liberal. Alphonsus was taught in the seminary a position which was quite conservative. And the controversy that's raging at his time in the church, and it is a strongly divided church in this. The Jansenist position, only a few can be saved. And then on the opposite, you have the Jesuit position, which is kind of the laxist position in some of its patrons, that doesn't matter what you do, you're going to be saved, because the love of Jesus Christ has forgiven already all sins anybody will ever commit. So it doesn't matter whether you sin or not. Just believe in Jesus. This is called fideism. And it's very close to what the Protestant churches were teaching. Martin Luther taught that in a kind of an extreme form as well. So the controversy, and it was strongly divided into two very extreme positions that were at war with each other. And they would actually physically assault and beat each other in these discussions that they would have. And they would mutually turn each other into the Holy See to be investigated as a heretic on one side or the other. Okay, the extreme position on one side had to do with the place of law, authority, and conscience in the moral life. And the extreme position on the rigorist, or the, we would call them today the right wing. They didn't call them right and left wings in those days, but it was called probabilism. And it taught that if the law, which is applicable to your life situation, the teaching of the church or the law, is vague or unclear, where do you look for help? Do you follow your conscience and just try to figure it out? Do you go to the experts and listen to them? Or do you just literally apply the law? And what if the experts disagree? Which expert do you listen to? So the probabilistic position, in its most extreme form, says experts are important. You follow the teaching of the church literally, or you follow the law literally. No exceptions, black and white, because to do otherwise, to listen to your conscience or to listen to an expert, you run the risk of committing a sin without even knowing it. And now that position was eventually condemned as heretical, okay, because it guts morality of the subject, which is essential according to the traditional teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas and the tradition of the Catholic Church since Jesus. It's about a free, conscious, deliberative, knowing choice. So you're going to surrender a free choice. The only thing you're doing is an act of obedience to the power of authority. You're not choosing the good. So it's not a moral act, really, in the true sense of a moral act, okay? The position that Alphonsus started out close to was not that extreme. It was close to it, but not near there. When the law is clear, you do what the law says. Everybody agreed on that. Even the laxists agreed. When the law is clear and how to apply the law is clear, you do what the law says. You do what the church's teaching says. The church's teaching says don't steal. You don't steal, period. But the later question arises, as St. Thomas raised it, how do you know when something is stealing? Is paying your taxes being robbed by the government? Is taking a loaf of bread in order to feed yourself when you're starving, is that stealing? Or is that preserving your life? How do you make those decisions? So sometimes it's unclear. And when it's unclear, who do you look to? Do you listen to your conscience? Or do you go looking and listen to experts? Okay, the probabilists would say, who are not on the extreme end, would say you listen to the experts. And one of the experts is the teaching of the church, is the magisterium, the Pope, even though there really is no magisterium at that time in the sense there is today. There weren't, official church teachings for the whole world yet, except through councils. But then you go to the experts, you go to the noteworthy and respected moral theologians, and you ask their opinion. And you look for the most probable opinion. And if most moral theologians agree that this is the most probable opinion, that the law should be applied in this way, you follow them. If there's no agreement among the experts, you apply the literal teaching of the law as best you can. But you never listen to your conscience, because your conscience is untrustworthy. Your conscience is your mind reasoning, and you reason improperly, and you make mistakes when you reason, and you can't trust your own mind to come to the right conclusions. But you can trust authority, and you can trust the law. Okay, so there's no freedom here. The only freedom you have is to follow the law, or to follow the authority, and the authority primarily of experts. On the opposite extreme, you have the laxist position, represented by a tiny number of Jesuits who were saying, the law doesn't matter. You should just follow your conscience. God gave you the ability to think, and you can, just by using your mind correctly, come to the knowledge of how to recognize what law applies to this situation and figure out the best way to apply it to this situation, even when it's confusing. And it doesn't really matter if you make a mistake, because God's love and mercy is greater than any mistake that you can make. Jesus has already paid the price for all sins that will ever be committed, and you're almost automatically forgiven as long as you're just trying hard, as long as you're just taking your life seriously and trying to figure out what's best for yourself. Okay, this would be considered the laxist. It doesn't matter if you sin, because it can always get fixed in the confessional. It doesn't matter how you live your life, because God's mercy is greater than the way you live your life. And that would be the extreme position, which was held by very, very few. And Alphonsus certainly wanted to avoid that. But in between that and where Alphonsus was, there was another position which was advanced by Busenbaum, which was probabilism, which said, when you don't know what to do, you go in and consult the experts, and if most experts say this is the most probable way of doing it, you follow them. But if even one says this is the best solution, and it sounds more probable to you, even if 20 others agree to a different thing or solution, and they say that's the most probable or the most correct, you can still follow that one. So all you need is to find one moral theologian, whether he disagrees radically with 50 others, and if he's a noteworthy expert and his opinion can be trusted because he knows what he's talking about, you can follow that one opinion because it's probable. That's all you need. Alphonsus was very uncomfortable with that because experts very often disagree. So Alphonsus came up with a medium, middle-of-the-road solution called Equi-Probabilism. And what he taught is this. Like everybody else, he taught when the law is clear, and when it's clear what law applies or what teaching applies to this situation, and how to apply it properly, you follow the law. That's what it's there for. That's why God gives us law. That's why the church has teachings and laws as a guide. But as you do it, use it as a guide to train your own mind, your own conscience, to recognize and understand why the church teaches what it teaches and the rightness of what the church teaches. So you see for yourself the goodness that you're being called to and the evil you're being asked to avoid and why it's evil. Okay? So use the law properly. When it's unclear to you what law applies or how to apply it correctly to your life situation, you ask the experts, you consult them. And if a number of them say that this is the most correct way of understanding how the law applies and this is what you should do, you listen to the majority of them. You listen to the group that has the greatest agreement. He would not feel comfortable with just following one opinion, basically. You seek the best opinions, but also in the process of listening to them, try to understand their arguments so you're training your conscience and mind, okay? And then you follow what is the most probable opinion. What if there's no agreement at all among the experts? What if they're all disagreeing and each advancing a completely different solution? since there is no general agreement, no reliable guide, follow your conscience. You are free to do what your conscience tells you to do is the right thing to do. So Alphonsus defends freedom of conscience over the absolute authority of law or even the magisterium of the church over an individual conscience, where these areas where it's very unclear how the church's teaching applies to this aspect of a personal life. Now, in the process, he also encounters and develops another idea. Some people, as he tries to explain to them and teach them through the moral catechesis, the teaching of the church, to help them understand why the church teaches what it does about sexual morality or about usury or about honesty and telling the truth and not stealing and your obligation to charity and helping the poor, he discovers that some people, because of their life circumstances or because of trauma they may have experienced in their life or because of their lack of adequate education, are just incapable of understanding any of it or ever seeing it in their conscience. They have a natural blind spot in their conscience. They are incapable of seeing the evil of certain actions which are objectively evil. And following the teaching of St. Thomas, who taught that you have to be able to see the evil in order for you to freely choose evil, which is the definition of a sin. So when a person has this blind spot, which is incurable, and by incurable he means I've tried for years to get through to them and they just can't understand it for whatever reason. There's a blindness in them. When they do those activities, they're not freely choosing what they know to be evil, and therefore they're not guilty before God. They're doing evil, but they're not held responsible by God. This is God's mercy steps in. They're still doing evil, and they should be maybe even stopped or constrained, and this is where the community has to come in to help them control where they don't control themselves because they don't see the evil of what they're doing. This he calls invincible ignorance. And he identifies it, and he's one of the first in the history of moral theology. And it's a very important concept today. And it's still not very, very well understood. Invincible means no matter what you do, it can never be fixed. And it's very rare, but it is real sometimes. Now, the other thing Alphonsus discovered was, he goes back to St. Thomas and he says, all right, St. Thomas teaches, the good moral act is when I see in my conscience the goodness that I'm called to, and then I freely choose in my will to do what my conscience reveals to me as good. And vice versa, when I see in my conscience the evil of an action, and I use my will to choose never to do that because I see the evil of it. And that's defined as a human act or a moral act, okay? And St. Thomas also taught that conscience is not a faculty. It's not a little angel or devil sitting on your shoulder talking to you. It's your mind reasoning in a modality of thinking. It's a way of thinking. Conscience is when I use my mind and my brain and my gift of reason to think about good and evil in concrete moral situations and try to figure out what is the right choice to make in a concrete situation. People are not born with that ability. We are born with the ability to know there's a difference between right and wrong, but to learn that one action is right and another is wrong, we have to learn that over time and we have to be taught that. And many people are not taught that. And you have to learn how to reason correctly. This is the scientist, the skeptic in him coming out. If you reason incorrectly and don't follow the proper reasoning steps, you come to a wrong conclusion thinking that you're right. If you come to 2 + 2 = 7, thinking that you're right, it isn't right. It's in fact wrong. You've just thought incorrectly. And there's a difference between mathematical and scientific reasoning and moral reasoning. The same conclusion might be right in one situation and wrong in another. Without falling into absolute relativism, you have to accept that reality because life is murky sometimes. And so he says, it's not fair to a person to hold him guilty before God for doing something when he had no idea of the wrongness of what he was doing. He was thinking that he was doing right when he did it. So he wasn't choosing what he knew to be evil. He was choosing what he thought to be right, but he was incorrect in what he was thinking. So it's unfair to hold people who've never been taught how to use their conscience correctly for arriving at bad conclusions that lead them to make bad choices. So he says, in the confessional, my confessors must be first healers of souls, because the sin, whether it's done deliberately or unintentionally, still wounds the soul, and it needs to be healed through the confessional. But two, it's unfair just to give them advice they can't understand. So in the confessional, the confessor must also be a judge. He must also be a teacher. And he's not just teaching them, this is right and this is wrong. We're supposed to be teaching them how to think about morality in a more correct and authentic way, so that they can make these decisions in their conscience for themselves that will lead them to the correct decisions. And he begins to write his moral theology in this direction. Moral theology in service of helping people in the confessional so that they can understand the teachings of the church, and so that the teachings of the church can become leaven that transform their lives so that they can become holy. And this is a new direction, and it is not well received. The laxists attack him for being a rigorist, and they have him investigated by the Vatican. The rigorists on the other side attack him for being a laxist, and they have him investigated by the Vatican as a heretic. When you stand in the middle of the road, you get hit by semi-trailers coming in both directions. And that's what happened, and it was a source of great suffering to Alphonsus. But in the end, the Holy Father, after extensive examination through the theological devices that he used, came out with an actual declaration, a pontifical decree, that any opinion about morality expounded or taught by Alphonsus Maria Liguori, he wasn't saint yet, by Alphonsus Maria Liguori, was trustworthy. And anyone could follow the opinion or the approach to moral theology of Alphonsus Maria Liguori and be absolutely certain that they were in perfect harmony with the tradition and teaching of the Church and its magisterium. Equi-Probabilism became the way of doing moral theology, and it transformed the practice of the use of the confession. Now, I share this with you because I remind you that with Alphonsus, it wasn't just the confessional, it was teaching people to pray along with the instruction in the confessional and in the catechetical sermons. So at this time, Alphonsus began to write pamphlets, he began to write more songs, he began to paint pictures of religious scenes that he gave out in large numbers to the simple people in the countryside who could not read, and the pictures and the songs became their books. And these also were extremely, extremely effective. And of course, we know that St. Alphonsus is remembered primarily in Italy because he is the author of the most popular and most sung Christmas carol every year in Italy, Tu scendi dalle stelle. He took one of those secular songs, music, changed it just a little bit, and he inserted very, very beautiful poetic spiritual lyrics. And it became the most well-known Italian Christmas carol still to this very day. But he did that with countless other songs as well. So he catechized in preaching, he catechized in through the way of his missions, which would often last 2 months sometimes in some of the towns. And above all, he wanted Redemptors to catechize primarily by the example of the community life of prayer that they themselves follow and live. And the last thing I wanted to say about this is, when Alphonsus went out on mission, and in his missions, he always did personal penance himself. Rather than imposing strict penances on people in the confessional, out of compassion for them, he imposed the penances on himself out of love for them. He did for them what Jesus did for the human race. And so he practiced a life of severe penance before he went on and while he was on any of his parish missions. He fasted, he prayed, he actually occasionally took the discipline. He wore the hair shirt. he did the traditional practices of penance, not out of a need to do penance for his own sin, but as an act of love to do penance for the sins of those who out of ignorance had fallen into sin, asking God to enlighten him and help him teach them how to pray and come to see the wrongness of the actions in their life so that they could change and transform their life. And he asked his fellow Redemptorists to do the same. So after the mission, the Redemptorists came home and lived a life of penance in their community for 3 to 4 months before going out on mission again. And during the mission, the Redemptorists as a team regularly gathered and lived a life of prayer and penance for the people to whom they were preaching and to whom the people they were preaching on the mission. And Redemptorists continue to do that in our mission teams and in our parish missions to this very day. So I hope these few brief words shared with you about the life and history of Alphonsus have been helpful to you, and at least, if not helpful, interesting at least, to help you come to know this man a little bit better. I'd like to just conclude with this. After Alphonsus was born, a couple days after his birth, as was the custom, many of the other noble families came to visit and see the new baby. And one of the most noteworthy people that came to visit the home of the Liguori and to see the newborn Alfonso Maria, actually Alfonso Maria Antonio Giovanni Francesco Cosimo Damiano Michelangelo Gasparro de Liguori, was a very, very noted and famous Jesuit missionary in Naples, renowned for his holiness. He worked with the dock workers. He ministered to the galley slaves rowing on the galleys of Liguori's father. And he was a very close friend because of that of the Liguori family. And he came and he took the newborn Alphonsus in his arms and he looked at his mother and he said, "Anna, this child will be greatly blessed. He is going to be a priest. He's going to be a bishop. He is going to found a religious order. He's going to live to be more than 90 years old, and he's going to lead countless souls to know the love of Jesus Christ." Then he handed the child back to his mother and left the room, leaving everyone dumbstruck. That prophecy, of course, kind of sums up the life history of Alphonsus, except we have to add to it. The prophecy was fulfilled. Obviously, he did do all of those things. He became a bishop and served as a bishop in a very problematic diocese, during which time he continued to develop his moral theology and his ascetical and religious teaching, his writing of his spiritual books for the poor and the abandoned. He eventually came back to his congregation and died there, looking at the Blessed Sacrament as he breathed his last moments. Several years later, in 1839, on May 26th, he was canonized, a saint of the Church, and on that very same day, the priest who had come to visit 2 days after his birth and had made that prophecy, Francesco Geronimo, the Jesuit missionary, was also canonized. Both the prophet and the fulfillment of the prophet were canonized together by the very same pope on the very same day, a minute or two apart from each other. Alphonsus was declared Doctor of the Church in 1871. He was proclaimed Doctor of Prayer at the same time, and he was proclaimed the patron saint of confessors and of moral theologians on April 26, 1950. We're living at a time where some of the same divisions are reappearing in our church, and some of the same arguments giving rise to the divisions that were present and prevalent at the time of Alphonsus. Alphonsus worked diligently to overcome and help the church move beyond them into a better way of being and ministering and reaching out to the people. We need to recover the vision of Alphonsus now more than ever, and I encourage you to pray with Alphonsus, to reflect with Alphonsus, to hear the voice of Alphonsus speaking through the last 200 years, and to open your heart to the love and the mercy of Jesus Christ, that he dedicated his life and that we, his followers, dedicate our lives to proclaiming, to receiving and to enjoying the benefits of. So may God bless you, and may we all celebrate the Feast of Alphonsus on August 1st with tremendous joy and gratitude.